All right. All right. Thanks everyone for joining today, our Trusted Sec webinar titled Penetration Testing Your Cloud Environment. We are coming to you live from the brand new intergalactic Trusted Sec headquarters here in Fair Lawn, Ohio, which is pretty excited. Probably if you've been checking us out on the social media, we have a brand new building, really nice. So we're pretty excited about it. So while cloud computing has been around for 12 years, as we said, testing the client security areas of responsibilities have lagged. So we really thought that it'd be a great time to share with you what we're doing in and around penetration in the cloud and the things that you should be looking out for. First, a few housekeeping items. We will definitely record this webinar, so you can go back and review it on our YouTube page. And certainly ask any questions in the Q&A function along the way. We'll make sure that we either get to them during, depending if it's pertinent to that particular slide, or at the end as we go through. A little bit about Trusted Sec. Our tagline is evolve beyond threats. And so we really constantly strive to stay ahead of those threats and the threat agents. Through our industry-leading attack intelligence research team, our innovations team, we've created several de facto standards and tools in security. And as evidenced by this webinar, as those threats continue to target cloud environments and the specifics of each platform, the teams at Trusted Sec are evolving to stay ahead for you as well. In looking at your full life cycle of your program, Trusted Sec can help with building it with risk program and compliance reviews and readiness, testing it. There's not only penetration testing, but customized testing as well. There's a lot going on in this space, all the way up to red teams, as you might imagine. Fixing it with the remediation of those issues that we find during the incidents or challenges. And then finally, we also help with incident response and forensics. So on to our speakers today. From the cloud team, we have Paul Berkland, Edwin David, and Patrick Mayo. Paul, take it away.
Thank you, Stephen. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Excited to talk to you about penetration testing in the cloud environments and some of the particulars about that. Before we get into it, though, I just want to introduce our team here. So my name is Paul Berkland. I am the team lead here for the Cloud Force team. A little bit about my background. I actually started hacking back in high school, get started talking about the novel network days, and breaking into the supervisor account on our school's network. The password was our superintendent's first name, Nancy, all lowercase. That was my start into hacking back in the day. I moved into IT operations and NOC work, doing server admin stuff. Took a break from hacking for a while, but eventually I came back to it. I started doing application security, got my OSCP, and moved into pen testing. I've got a couple CVEs for Skype for Business, for some cross-site scripting where you're able to pop a window or pop really any URI on a remote Skype for Business client. For anybody who is logged in, they didn't even need to accept your message, but that got fixed pretty quickly. I've got a minor one for Nessus, and I've also got a link timing attack that did not get a CV because Microsoft does not consider user enumeration to be a vulnerability. But that's kind of where I come from. I'm going to hand it over to Edwin David to speak about his experiences and his role here.
I'm Edwin David, former system administrator. My primary experience is in Active Directory, group policy, security baselining, Azure security. I am certified in 365 security administration, as well as in Azure security engineering. During my time, during my sysadmin days, I slowly got into hacking, CTFs, Hack the Box, so forth. And then now I moved over to Trusted Sec, where I'm a cloud penetration tester, and I've been with Trusted Sec for 9 months.
Great. And Patrick, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes. Hello, I'm Patrick Mayo. I've been with Trusted Sec about as long as Edwin has. I previously worked with government agencies, Department of Defense agencies, to help secure their networks and kind of the asset compliance role. Since then, I sort of had the bug about trying to figure out why these changes were being made in order to secure our systems, but no real explanation was given. So I started learning hacking and getting a better idea about why attacks occurred, what made them function, and how they actually were successful. That led to me getting my OACP, OSWE, and eventually moving on to different companies where I got a focus in AWS. That's kind of where I spend most of my time now in that kind of playground, seeing what I can find and what I can help people with.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. All right. So next we're going to talk a little bit first about what is the cloud, because a lot of people have different ideas about what the cloud is. For us, what we're going to be focusing on are going to be the three primary providers, and really mostly AWS and Azure here. There are private cloud providers that offer a variety of services. Some of them have been growing in recent years, but the main ones are still those three on the left there: AWS, Azure, and GCP. And the attack surfaces that are there are particular to clouds. And actually, I should say also that generally speaking, what cloud is, would you say is infrastructure as a service or software as a service, but basically where somebody else is managing portions or all of the service. And that can fall into the realm of identity access management, storage, or compute, or serverless functions, to name a few there. So the attack surface of the cloud is actually pretty varied, and it's based off of whatever services you're using within the cloud environment. So we're going to take a brief segue here, and I want to look at some of the attacks that we see in the news or ones that are popular. So for that, we're first going to look at AWS and talk a little bit about some of the most common attack pathways there. I'm going to hand this over to Patrick again.
Yeah, so with AWS, there's generally a fair amount of news over time with different attacks, and they kind of seem to generally fall into a number of different categories. The main one being credentials harvested from different locations. One of the most recent ones was Travis CI credentials revealing a lot of different logs, a lot of different credentials in their logs that were public. Another one focuses a lot around misconfiguration, and that can be misconfiguration of the IAM policies, the various services that are running in the environment, and whatever the customers are using. One of the big ones around misconfiguration was the recent SSRF, recent to a couple of years ago, the Capital One SSRF breach that led to access to a large amount of S3 bucket information.
Perfect. And so just to add in there real quick, so with AWS, kind of the initial attack vectors seem to fall into just a couple categories there. As Patrick said, either leak credentials, misconfiguration of some resources like buckets that are open, or web application like SSRF or remote code execution there, where people are then able to pivot from there. And it doesn't even have to be necessarily something that's wrong with the code that a customer is publishing itself. It might be something in the stack there, but as long as there's some web application failure, that can lead to an entry into the cloud environment. So that's just kind of going over the main entry points for Amazon there. And next, I'm going to hand it over to Edwin, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the entry points for Azure environments.
Yeah, so there's a threat actor, UNC 2452. That threat actor is synonymous with the SolarWinds breach that happened a few years ago. And a lot of that breach occurred in the cloud, particularly with a methodology similar to our own and what we use to penetrate cloud environments. So they began with password spraying, looking for weak passwords. In particular, they attacked ADFS workloads, which is something very common that we encounter as well. And then they also did a lot of MFA bypasses, whether it's push request bypasses, getting a hold of accounts that have not enrolled into MFA. So they take a phone under their control and enroll MFA on the behalf of the user. They also used Azure AD applications and either maliciously modified existing ones or created new ones and did things like spear phishing and consent grant attacks to allow them to laterally move within Azure environments. Along with that, other not high profile attacks, but high profile exposures. There's been a number of bug bounties in the news from the past year. All these occurred within the past year. There was a remote code execution for Linux servers. All Linux servers run an OMI agent, and those were vulnerable to a remote code execution attack that gave root access to Linux servers. And then the five bug bounties mentioned right below in the slide deck were bug bounties that caused cross-account and tenant access into other Azure environments. So the bug bounties are, obviously ongoing. This is just kind of a maturity in Azure that we're just seeing, where things do exist. Microsoft quickly remediates them, and we're seeing that in the news. So I wanted to highlight those just because of the cross-tenant account access.
Perfect. And so just looking a little bit between the two of them. So AWS, we have more credentials and misconfigurations, web application, whereas on the other side, on the Azure side, you're actually seeing kind of ones that more target, well, with the exception of the bug bounties, ones that target the users, the end users as the weakest link, the spear phishing attacks and password spraying. So those are kind of some of the trends that you see as far as initial access points or initial attack vectors in the cloud environment there. So defining a cloud pen test can be kind of tricky. Depending on what services a customer is running can really change what attack surface there is, and therefore what testing can be done. And there's a good question, like, how do you delineate a cloud pen test from other types of engagements? So strictly speaking, Azure and AWS both have defined testing scopes. So with Azure here, you can see it's pretty open. They have some pretty broad categories here. We have Azure Active Directory, Microsoft Azure, O365, the Power Platform, et cetera. So, I mean, pretty wide open there. You can see the shared responsibility model. This is what both AWS and Azure use to kind of illustrate where the responsibility falls. So you can easily see the differences between the software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service, where that falls. Now, Amazon has something very similar, just slightly differently portrayed here. But you can see, again, they delineate what's in scope here. We have EC2 instances, Elastic Load Balancers, et cetera, Amazon API Gateway and Lambda functions. So they both clearly define what's involved or what can be tested. And I just want to briefly touch on what we traditionally don't touch in a cloud pen test, and that would be just gray box type things. So if you're hosting an application in the cloud, at least to us, that's an application assessment. That'd be it's mostly just a matter of time, and where you want to focus your time that's spent. So it's a hybrid area where you have the application running in the cloud. So there are cloud aspects to it. Like if there's an issue in the application that could lead to RCE or SSRF, that's obviously going to then run into the cloud environment. But I guess that's analogous to saying that, in traditional days, it would be going from an external or an application assessment to an internal. So the cloud environment is the new internal in that scenario. And the other thing that is that wouldn't traditionally be touched on a cloud pen test is the internal network resources connected via VPN. Obviously, we want to focus on the cloud configuration and the penetration testing of the cloud itself, the cloud environment. So with that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about comparing traditional tests to cloud pen testing. Now, there are some similarities, mainly that VM utilization is still pretty high. A lot of people still use AD or single sign-on user management. Asset inventory and patch management is still an issue that we see even in the cloud environment, because the lack of patches or forgetting to patch things is a constant struggle for a lot of customers here. And then users with bad passwords is something that we find regularly as well. And that's kind of more on the Azure side, but it's something that hasn't changed between traditional pen testing and modern, especially those last two there, I would say. The patch management and users with bad passwords, those are two things that kind of continue on across from internal on-premises to cloud. There are a number of differences though. And I guess the main one would probably be that there's a lot more focus on IAM permissions and roles that are assigned. Another difference is that the cloud provider is going to be managing a lot of these services. So things get patched, things get fixed. The way we interact with these environments is different even. So, you know, from the standard network perspective, port scanning and looking for open services, that doesn't work with all the cloud stuff because you're going to miss a lot. That's not, you don't interact with it in that manner. It's not a network level service per se. And then the other issue is that anything can be public, usually with a few wrong clicks. Anything can potentially be public that's stored in the cloud. There's a few differences too that I want to talk about that pertain to testing itself. So with traditional pen testing on an internal, for instance, you might send them a box to plug into a user workstation subnet to replicate, you know, either somebody putting a malicious box on the network or a malicious user that has access to that network. That provided opportunity for like man-in-the-middle attacks. That isn't really there in the cloud environment. There's also no really push button exploits, you know, like MS08, 067, things like that, like aren't going to be sitting around in a cloud environment usually. If there is an RCE of some sort that affects things where it shouldn't, Microsoft or Amazon are going to patch that. It's not the same really attack surface that you find on the internal. There's a lot fresher systems as part of that too, is that a lot of these people, when they set up the cloud environments, they're starting fresh. And they're not, it's not something that you set up back in 1995 before security was really widespread. It's not, you know, you can actually architect these out and plan for a good network from the get-go, and you can make sure you're following best practices. And it's a lot easier to kind of start fresh there. Whereas a lot of the on-premises networks, yeah, I mean, I'm sure we've all had that where there's a box that you can't get rid of, or there's just some legacy system that has to be there. And with the cloud environments, you don't really see as much of that because it's a fresh slate and everything's brand new there. And that kind of goes to also with boxes that are not really forgotten about. You know, you don't have that server sitting in a closet that's been there forever that you're not really sure what it does. In reality, you'd be being charged for this in the cloud, and you're probably keeping a tighter eye on it because that might be costing you, you know, $87, $100 and some dollars a month, depending on what it is. It's really eating in your pocketbook versus just the electricity cost of having some forgotten server there. So there's some real big differences as far as penetration testing in the cloud environment and what you're going to encounter, and just really the means of testing those. It's a lot different. It's a newer, fresher environment, and the testing looks a little bit different too because of that. And actually, the last thing I want to focus on here is that just that the focus is on misconfigurations. You're not really going to find that many exploits for the most part. You know, you might find where people are not doing best practices, or people have made mistakes with overly permissive roles. They might have stored credentials insecurely, or they just chose bad credentials, period. Those are the type of things that you're going to find. And there is an aspect of network pen testing there still. You know, services running on EC2 or on VMs, those are still fair game. But just a lot of the time, the attacks are going to revolve around misconfigurations, generally speaking. So now we're going to talk a little bit about AWS and Azure testing and how they're different, because they're both in the cloud, but and you might have seen kind of when we were talking earlier, there are some differences there. And I'm going to hand this over to Patrick if you want to speak first about the AWS side.
Yeah, so for the AWS side, we kind of feel like there's a higher focus on a sort of developer workflow. And as Paul was saying as well, with it sort of being a fresher environment, things are able to be engineered from the developer's perspective as well as the infrastructure engineer's perspective in order to get the type of environment that they want properly have set up, and potentially even have it also configured as infrastructure as code, so it can be stood up and torn down as needed, regardless of whichever region it's deployed to. This also with AWS is not really a lot of users, like general users. There are in many cases, many like developer users and admin users that do have access to the AWS console or command line and can interact with it that way. And those may still be configured to log in through SSO, maybe even leveraging O365 Azure AD to do so, but there's not the same level of general users as you would have for someone using O365 for regular user email management. So it's a little bit different there. So a lot of our focus becomes on what IAM roles and user permissions are configured for those accounts, for those users that can get in, and where those roles are being leveraged within the environment by different AWS resources. So having a good controller around that lets you better understand what you can get access to.
Perfect. And yeah, I especially about the number of users, that's a main thing I think with AWS that really makes it different is that, yeah, you don't have that many general users. Most of the people who are going to be logging into the AWS environment at all are going to be tech savvy and developer admin nature. So now, Edwin, do you want to go over some of the differences with Azure testing?
Yeah. So one of the primary differences is we have a lot more users and password opportunities in Azure, and that's primarily has to do with Office 365 licensing. And when organizations deploy Azure AD Connect, and then they start syncing all their on-prem Active Directory users to the cloud. And that kind of traverses into, direct and indirect rights to resources in the cloud. And that's where we kind of see a lot of misconfigurations, if you will, when you have your entire user base out there. Along with that, I added a conditional access review and validation because that's kind of the gatekeeper to the various cloud workloads that we're trying to get into. So whether that's requiring MFA or restricted by like certain IP addresses where you can only access certain workloads within the confines of an IP address space. Those are some of the common differences that we really kind of see. So there's a bigger threat surface when it comes to Microsoft Azure.
Perfect. And yeah, going out along with that, the external attack surface for Azure is just more so, at least in regards to authentication and brute forcing. For instance, an interesting thing is with the user login logic for AWS, there is not really a great user enumeration. You can tell if they have MFA enabled, it'll prompt you for MFA, but that's, so you're able to enumerate users that have MFA enabled. And with that, you still need to know the account ID. So it's a lot more involved, whereas Microsoft, especially with using email addresses as your identity and making it so easy to look up and see if a user is valid or not, it really opens up the doorway for phishing and password sprays, really, targeting the user layer and users actions there. So I mean, I guess that's what I would say is also one of the biggest takeaways between the two, is that there's just a lot more attack surface in the sense of authentication attacks on Azure that are possible there from the default. Next, we're going to go a little bit into some of the attack surfaces, and these are not by any means comprehensive. These are just kind of an idea, give you an idea of some of the things that can be looked at during a cloud assessment. And again, this all really revolves around what services people are utilizing and how much they're utilizing them as far as what the attack surface is that's available. So with that, I'm going to hand this one over to Patrick.
Thanks. So one of the main things that we kind of focus on with the AWS attack surface is the IAM permissions and what's configured for the individual users, roles, and policies, because that sort of defines what AWS resources those individual identities can get access to, what they can leverage and what they can pull and what they can change. So having a good idea of where those connections are and which identities can assume roles and go in the different pathways allows us to build an idea of where a privileged escalation path might lie in order to further enumerate and gain access to the environment and show the impact that an actual attacker could have. We also look heavily into trying to see if there are cases where sensitive information, such as passwords, API keys, and like security credentials, might be stored in metadata in different locations. That could be like the EC2 metadata, or maybe even the environmental variables for Lambdas, ECSs, and AKS configurations. There's a lot of different locations, even confirmation, where such things could be stored, and if done so incorrectly, insecurely, then they can be retrieved and used in different ways. One of the last things that we sort of focus in on as well, as in sort of a grand scheme of things, is looking for misconfigurations just in the AWS services themselves, to try to see if there are certain ones that could be tuned this way to be a little bit more secure, or configured in a different way to provide more redundancy or better backup options, or somewhere along that path.
Awesome. And Edwin, I'm going to hand this next one over to you to talk a little bit about the attack surface of Azure.
Yeah, so we first start out with user enumeration, and we'll test that against some various workloads like OneDrive for Business or Microsoft Teams for user enumeration access. And then, we'll move over to password spray attacks using just traditional weak credentials, such as months, seasons, followed by year. And that'll usually net us some accounts. And, once we do get those accounts, then we'll proceed to start doing some conditional access testing, seeing what kind of workloads that we can access off-prem, seeing if there's any misconfiguration with customer tenants conditional access, whether it's geo-IP blocking or banning off-prem devices, that sort of thing. So, and then from there, we move on to some of the more traditional penetration testing, where we'll scan for open ports, vulnerable software that may be loaded on Azure VMs, because that's similar to on-prem environments. Kind of at that point, seeing if we can gain a better foothold into the Azure environment. And then along with that, we'll do an asset inventory and config review of some things, because sometimes we'll have a scoping, and we may need to further define it if a customer can't tell us like what kind of IP addresses they're using, or specific information like storage account names, that sort of thing. So we'll do an asset inventory to make sure that we're keeping in scope with any type of rules of engagements that are done during our penetration tests. And then we'll look at things like guest Azure AD access, because by default, any user in a company can invite guests into a company, and that just presents opportunity for additional footholds and enumerating an entire client environment. And we'll also do sensitive data hunting in Azure. There's multiple threat surfaces that we can get clear text credentials from. And we'll also examine public IPs for any type of exposed services, whether it's like RDP, SQL, anything that may be unintended, that sort of thing. Microsoft Teams, we're looking primarily for there. If guest access is allowed, we enumerate users that way. So that's another good threat service that we do testing on, along with any type of sensitive data in SharePoint and OneDrive. Also, if information sharing is allowed across the organization, how high is that set to? Are they allowed to share outside the organization, or is it primarily contained within the organization? So, and then lastly, we do storage account permissions testing. So we'll check and see if there's any type of public blob access that's accessible outside that would allow us to download files from storage accounts from customer tenants that probably shouldn't be able to be accessed.
Awesome. Thank you, Edwin. So, and those were brief overviews. There's actually a couple of great attack frameworks that you can reference. MITRE has the attack matrix, and they have those matrices, and they have those for Azure O365, and then infrastructure as a service and software as a service. There's also one that the Cloud Security Alliance, or the CSA, released, the Cloud Penetration Testing Playbook, and that covers AWS and Azure. And that really, both of them are really great references if you're looking to make sure that you cover all your bases. There's going to be a link to both of those at the end of the slide deck, just so you can check those out. But they're fantastic resources that go a bit more in depth and talk a little bit more about the full attack surfaces that are there. So I definitely recommend checking those out. So this kind of leads into our next section, which is the testing perspectives and how we attack the cloud and what we found is the best way. And kind of going back, I remember getting my first cloud pen testing book, and it was basically like this. It said, like, begin the attack on the cloud. Step 2, and then you come up with some awesome privileges somehow, and that's how you're going to do your pen test of the cloud. So that there's a lot of ambiguity there. Obviously, the recommended ones would be like spear phishing or password spraying, but those just can't be relied upon if you're focusing on a cloud penetration test and you really want to test that, peel back that layer and test your cloud environment. So what we use is nothing new. It's basically assumed access. And by assumed access, we mean that we will test externally, but we're also going to have an account provision, just kind of as many pen tests, internal pen tests used to be done, and some still are done like that, where you're provisioned a user account as your foothold on the network. So we like to kind of look at what your environment is, see what maybe some likely attack paths are, or where somebody might land in your cloud environment. If it's AWS and you're hosting an app, maybe we want to look at what that app's running as and see what roles it has assigned and what it can access if somebody were to get RCE on that box or on that host. So it's good to look at what you have, figure out what some likely attack points might be, and then we can test from those particular vantage points. But it doesn't just have to be those. What we also will do is we'll also take the bird's eye view. So we also will usually get a security auditor account of some sort so that we can review at a high level what your configuration is. And we're not trying to do a configuration review. We're trying to find actionable, exploitable issues that we can prove out a proof of concept on, or otherwise exploit to show that there's an attack path there. The assumed access model just gives us some flexibility with bypassing that phishing or bypassing that spear phishing or password sprays. I'm not saying that those aren't good things to do, and those would be great as part of a red team, or if you want to do a multi-part assessment. But for our purposes, we really want to focus on the cloud environment and get you the most bang for your buck there, focusing on that and not worrying about the initial means of compromise. If you remember our news slides there, a lot of those ones, leaked credentials or a bad web app for AWS, and then Azure, it's going to be phishing or password sprays. So, I mean, those are some of the most common entry points into the networks, into the cloud environments, I should say. So that's why we go with the assumed access model. It just really helps to focus things and to get you really concentrated testing. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about planning for success. And if you decide to have a cloud pen test, some of the things that you might want to consider and kind of prepare for leading into that, so that you can get the most for your money and that everybody can have a good and successful test. So with that, I am going to hand this over to Edwin, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the cloud scoping challenges.
Yeah, so there's really no easy button whenever it comes to pulling out everyone's resources on what they're running in the cloud. We use cloud scoping scripts that pulls out like minimal information for us that we need during unauthenticated testing, so that we're not attacking somebody else's environment. Along with those scoping challenges, we deal with where some clients may want specific subscriptions tested, where other subscriptions just may be out of scope. So we got to pay adherence to that. Storage account names, that's a good one. That's something that we need to know in advance because Microsoft and AWS, You can name storage accounts anything that you want. It does not have to be company name specific. So we have to ask those in advance. And then we have to deal with IP address ranges, whether they're static or dynamic. We need to know that, especially if, a client reboots something with a dynamic IP address and the changes. If we're not aware of that, that can cause some problems as well. And then it is quite common where VMs will have both a public and private IP range. So we may have to test that resource twice because of firewall rules and whatnot, and what type of services is open from the public IP address versus what type of services is open on the private IP range. And we need to know virtual machine counts. It's really just we really just need to know how big of an environment that we're going to be testing, so that we're giving adequate time to the client to test everything properly. And then we'll get into Azure and AWS specific workloads like automation accounts, EC2 instances, S3 buckets, that sort of thing. So scoping is just always a challenge because sometimes customers don't know what they're running. Other times, some things may be out of scope. So we have to really pay careful attention to that, because some environments can be running a lot of subscriptions and have a lot more stuff in it.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's perfect. Exactly about especially with the storage account names, we can't tell those ahead of time. So, and just the breadth of services that are out there, two cloud environments can be very different. Some customers are very minimal, and they might only have a few. They might only be using like O365 as far, and be syncing up to the cloud, but they might just be using that and not using any of the other Azure services. In which case, actually a configuration review would probably be best in that case if it's very minimalist. So it's an initial challenge. It's not quite the same as saying how many external IPs are there or how many internal IPs do you have, and building off of that kind of. So prior to scoping this out, when you're thinking about getting a cloud pen test, I'd say you should definitely meet with your technical folks and ask them what they think maybe some of the likely entry points could be, because they're going to know the environment the best, and we will talk with you and figure that out with the technical folks or via network diagrams and scoping scripts. But really, before you get to the point where you're looking at a cloud pen test, I would reach out to your technical folks and ask them, where do you see some of the exposures being that we should focus on? Because then when you get into the cloud pen test, you can really, define that I want to look at this specific role or this specific application. What could be done if this was compromised? Because those are the likely landing points, that are going to get into your network. Or if you have a jump box that you use to get into your AWS environment, what if a developer's credentials were compromised there and they were able to get access to that jump box with the dev creds? So I mean, think about your environment. It's not just quite as easy as internal external scoping goes. So and yeah, we're happy to help you inventory and identify what you're running in your environment. That's something that a lot of people have a little bit of trouble with. Is I mean, it's nice that it's all there in the cloud that you can get an inventory of it, but sometimes it gets away from you and you might not know all that's being deployed out there. Yeah, there's definitely some unique scoping challenges that pertain only to the cloud that traditional pen tests were just much simpler to scope out. So with that, we're gonna go into just the last stage here of getting ready for the test and kind of things to be aware of and leading up to the test, especially using the assumed access model and all that, things that you might want to be aware of just to get the kind of general housekeeping out of the way to make sure that your test will go smoothly. And for that, I'm going to hand you over to Patrick.
Yeah, for the last things to get ready for the test is really kind of a couple things that we need in order to follow that assumed access model. The first one being an account or some type of role that we can log into or assume so we can have access to and permissions in order to query the cloud services to see what the configurations are and see where our options lie. That kind of couples in with the permissions that we're given, and that goes in together with what Paul was saying with how the test wants to be carried out, like what perspective is being taken for the assumed access. Is it a web app that has a specific IAM role that's being assumed compromised, or is it like a developer whose account has become compromised and then we're logging in with the same access that either the developer or that web app has access to? The next one is the line of communication. That's really just kind of who do we talk to, how often do they want updates, and what is important to them in order to be communicated. The rules of engagements help us sort of clarify not only what's in scope, that's an obvious one, but also when it's okay to do testing, which goes with the established testing hours, as well as what can be tested and what shouldn't be touched. If there's anything like you can test these services, but any with this tag, this name should not be included, is one that we kind of get pretty frequently. The last one we get questioned a lot is if we need to alert Microsoft or AWS about the testing that was to be completed. And they used to have requirements that they be notified with a whole form submission and everything, but they've released on that a couple of years ago, at least for AWS, and we're generally able to test without having to give them prior notification. We just need to have all of our stuff coordinated in a row.
Perfect. That's excellent. And so, yeah, that pretty much wraps up what we were here to share today. We're happy to take any questions, though. If anybody has any questions about cloud penetration testing, I see we have a few here in the Q&A we'll be going through. So let's see here. Sorry, I'm just trying to pick out. So let's just start here at the bottom. With respect to Azure syncing with AD, are there more security issues even with MFA when doing a two-way sync? So it depends. And Edwin, if you want to hop in here, I guess what I would say is the main security issues that you see with Azure, even with MFA, are registrations allowed from outside the company. That's the number one way that we'll find somebody with a weak password that has not registered for MFA yet. And it kind of seems to be a blind spot that a lot of organizations have, is that they're allowing remote MFA enrollment. Not everybody's enrolled already. So that's one of the main ways that we'll be able to get into a system, even if their users are using MFA. And the other way is doing the push notifications, right? There are more secure ways to do MFA. There's some insecure ways, which are just accepting push. And then there's ones where you have to like enter the number in, and that's the more preferred and secure way of doing that. Because what we'll do is we'll just spam people. And if they don't realize that the order of operations means that somebody has to have their password if they're getting the MFA request, then they might not notify security. They might not notify their help desk. They might just keep their password, and you can keep spamming them until they slip up or they mistakenly think that it's for one of their valid ones. So that's really one of the main ways. And then the other part of that that kind of goes in with that is conditional access. Is often people have conditional access set up and they'll say, oh, we already have conditional access preventing that. But there are ways around a lot of the conditional access policies. So for instance, you might come from an Azure VM logging in, and that might be allowed versus, coming from a geo IP that's located, or an IP address that's geolocated elsewhere. And this kind of goes, I think I saw another question up here. What are the major differences in offensive OPSEC considerations between cloud and traditional AD environments? So Microsoft very much is the pay for play security model. If you give them more money, you get better alerting and better security. So basically, the main things that we get caught on, at least externally, are going to be doing password sprays. If you get a successful hit and it tries to log in then, and it's not from the right geolocation or not the right time, that's another way that defenders will locate you, is really looking at the location and time. And yeah, those are the two main external OPSEC things, I would say. Edwin, do you have anything to add there as far as Azure logging and the licensing types?
Yeah, the free tier, you get 7 days worth of logging. P1 and P2, you get 30 days worth of logging. You can extend that more by ingesting those logs into a SIEM, whether it's on-prem or through like Azure Sentinel. And then you can extend the life of that logging if you have requirements around how long you're supposed to retain those types of logs. So hopefully that helps answer some of that question.
Nice. Let's see here. Next question, anonymous attendee. Are you saying that Azure has tied user access to other MS services like Teams, O365, et cetera, with no separation? I guess I would say as long as it's licensed, yes. Edwin, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you're typically licensing users. You're first you're syncing those users out to Azure, and then you're licensing those same users with Office 365 licenses. So they're tied with Teams, O365. I guess it is possible to have tenant separation where you're not syncing Active Directory accounts to the cloud, and instead users have separated cloud accounts and then on-prem accounts. But I really don't see that too much. Normally I encounter the above where, the traditional of syncing Active Directory accounts to the cloud, and then those services are tied to those users.
Awesome, thank you. The next one down, are there tools to carry out these assessments? And the answer is yes and no. I would say cloud tools, there are some fantastic ones out there. DirkJan, I believe, has the road tools for Azure. There's a number of cloud tools for various parts of this. I guess the thing where I would say no is that it's not a one-click stop, so to speak. It's there's a lot of review and contextual information, I would say, where you have to look at the environment and how it's set up. And there are flags certainly that you can alert on, kind of like Scout Suite, for instance, is a great tool that'll kind of give you a high level heads up of configuration issues, but that's not gonna, it's identifying configuration issues. I think we have a number of homebrew tools that we use, like for scraping and things like that. There are a lot of great tools out there though for AWS and Azure. I will see if I can find one here quick and post it in chat while somebody else answers another question here. But there's some of the GitHub lists, like the what is it? There's Azure and AWS pen testing lists of tools on GitHub. I just have to find one of those, but those are great references. Some people have really done a great job collecting what's out there and listing it out. But yeah, there certainly are tools for a lot of this. It's just I would really reference, actually I'm going to go forward here a couple. All right, right here. So I would reference this and check out especially the CSA penetration testing playbook. So if you're interested in doing some of this testing on your own, I would check this out. It's got a great overview of what you can test and kind of the things to look for. And then that can lead you into your GitHub hunt and finding the exact tools for the job. The tools are constantly evolving. Some other ones that are great, Trevor Spray, that's out there. PMapper for Privesk and AWS. Edwin or Patrick, do you have anything you want to toss out there just as some of your favorite tools?
Yeah, Microburst is one of my favorites also. Has a lot of automation to it, and it aggregates a lot of information for me and saves me a lot of time. So that's definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah, PMapper is pretty good. I like that. Paco is also a good one for AWS that I've used frequently. There's most of the time lately I've been leaning on the number of AWS scripts that I've written for trying to harvest out secrets and configuration files and various other locations in AWS metadata. I'm planning to release those, but they're not ready yet. So look forward to it.
Awesome. So the next one down, do you test subscription or account escapes into other company subscriptions or accounts, for example, from dev to prod subscription account? So it depends on if it's something that they want us to focus on. Oftentimes that has not been something that's been brought up, but we can definitely explore those scenarios and see if there's any Privesk methods or lateral movement that could be done from one to the other. It's just something that, to be honest, we haven't had a lot of questions for at this point. Edwin, do you or Patrick, do you have anything else to add there?
No, I don't.
No, okay. All right, what do you see with Azure automation accounts? What testing can you use to validate the configuration?
So I can probably help with that. So automation accounts, they use these things called runbooks. And those runbooks are variables in code. It's really not best practice, but anyway, people can store credential objects within those automation accounts. And a lot of times those accounts are like in clear text. So those are really kind of ripe on finding credentials. So if I see a tenant running those automation accounts, I'll start digging into what they're doing and looking even on like deployment resource logs, stuff like that, see if somebody is embedded a clear text credential somewhere, or in some cases you get into that automation run book and the credential is stored right there, whether it's like an API key or a username and password that's actually doing something. So that's why I wanted to mention automation accounts earlier. That's one thing that we do hunt for when we're looking for credentials to escalate our own privileges.
Nice. Do you see any issues with people who are configuring the Active Directory in the cloud who do not properly understand how permissions are inherited, opening up their attack surface, and how do you educate them? Are there big differences people should be aware of as they move to the cloud? So my take on that is, right now, we actually don't see a whole lot of role assignment in a lot of places. So they'll have the traditional groups in there, but a lot of the Azure specific roles, I don't see them being used a whole lot in a lot of places. Some places do use them more heavily than others, but a lot of places just, especially if they're primarily on-prem, they're just syncing to the cloud. I don't think they're using those roles. However, this has traditionally been an issue, especially with on-prem stuff, where you have, nested groups, and now all of a sudden you have 100 administrators by accident or unintentionally. So that's definitely been a thing in the past. I suspect that as the cloud environment matures and as people continue to use the cloud more and more, that this will be an issue. As far as educating them, I mean, I think that this is something that can be, it's not so much an end user education, right? It's more like a technical education. So the people in those positions that are monitoring that should be aware of that. I guess I would just try to demonstrate, the admin through proxy, so to speak. Edwin, do you have anything, or Patrick, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think one permission that just stands out for me because they don't think about, or it's not really synonymous with like VMs. So like contributor access is like a big one for me, because you can modify stuff, and in some cases, you may give contributor access at the subscription level, but that subscription may contain like all your VMs. So essentially anybody that has that role is basically NT system authority on all those VMs. So that's really kind of a good one, because I know there's a lot of like attention around like RBAC roles, like global admin and that type of stuff. But contributor access is definitely right for privilege escalation inside of Azure tenants. So that would probably be my biggest one.
Nice. Next one down, can you speak about the dangers of Azure guest accounts and apps, and how easy is it to use those accounts and apps to compromise a network? So the guest account aspect, the main thing there is that it's super easy to invite people, and by default, anybody can invite people, or invite guests, even other guests. So this is just really letting a potential foothold into your network go if you don't monitor those guest accounts well. The other part of that is, it's kind of a long shot there, but dynamic groups and stuff, if you base it off of a name at all, there is a proposed attack where you could, create a guest account or invite a guest that has a keyword. Like, let's say you have a dynamic group that's using anybody with admin in their username. You create a guest account to an email address at a domain you control that includes admin, and then you could, that is a hypothetical attack path using the guest. The main thing for guests, though, is really just that inside look into the network, lists of users, applications, etc. And I'm sure Edwin has more to add here. But then going on to the application side, The risk there is that I think a lot of people just aren't used to application phishing. So if you send somebody a request and if you don't have it locked down, they can accept at least some things without admin access or admin consent required. And this it's a little more complex than that. It depends on if it's a multi-tenant app or a single tenant app. For instance, if somebody phishes or compromises your the Azure environment and deploys their own application, then they can phish other people in your environment without those protections that would be if they were to try phishing them from an external tenant, if that makes sense. Basically, it's the applications can do a lot of things depending on what grants you give them. So they can read emails, it can modify and send emails, it can access any resources that you have really as long as you consent to it. And the danger is that people might not be aware of this attack path. It's that it's really easy to accept. And then the other part is that you can maintain persistence with this, maintain persistence for like 90 days at least. By refreshing, you get a refresh token and you can keep refreshing that. So the problems with the apps is that there's a really good possibility for persistence there, and not just like a low level persistence, but if your domain has been compromised at some point, like not domain compromised, but a user on your domain, and they're able to deploy an app, then they can further phish internally and use that to maintain more access. So get refresh tokens for a bunch of different people and keep those alive. Then you can just assume any of their rights that were assigned with Graph. So Edwin, did you want to add into that part?
No, I think that thoroughly covered it.
Cool. Yeah. So let's see, next one down. My whole business runs solely on O365 Power Apps and Power Automate. Aside from credential management and accidental disclosure, what other potential problems should I be looking for? Is there a way to get logging from these services? Edwin,
yeah, I can answer this. So I think one of the big things here is audit logging on sign-ins, because whenever somebody signs in to Azure, you see their sign in and then you actually see what workload that they're accessing. And that's highly important. So if you're not doing that today, depending on your subscription level, because Azure Sentinel, to ingest logs into Azure Sentinel, that requires at least an Azure ADP 1 level. I would highly suggest just doing that, even if you have like an on-prem SIEM. That way you're catching stuff, and you know, it's always highly possible that an on-prem SIEM could miss some things. But that's probably where I would start with some of those workloads, is who is accessing them and where they're coming from. And you'll be able to tell that from the Azure AD audit logs. And especially if you're ingesting it into something like a Sentinel, then you can configure alerting. You know, if somebody is coming from a range that, like, you know, outside of the United States, for instance, something that would be highly odd, you would get alerted on. The other thing I would suggest too is if you're really concerned about those, that they may have some sensitive data in it, you can always go the conditional access route too, and making sure that those workloads are properly secured, whether it's by MFA, making sure that somebody satisfies an MFA claims request for one of those workloads, or if you want to go like the geo IP route and, you know, ban certain IP addresses, or maybe only allow certain IP addresses to access those workloads. That's another way that you can attack that too, to kind of minimize that threat surface if you're worried about who is accessing stuff like Power Automate, Office 365, and so forth.
Awesome. Thanks, Edwin. The next one down, we just have a question about wiz.io. I'm actually not familiar with it, but I'm pulling it up as we speak. And it looks pretty cool. It looks like basically slightly similar to some of the things that might be built in on Azure or AWS, with some of the threat management, the threat tools that identify where your configuration is lacking. I'm sure this has its own spin to it. And I mean, I believe there are other ones too, like Rapid7, I believe, is that the Insight IDR? They also have one that will do, it'll take a look at your environment. It seems very similar though to the configuration review that's kind of like the Azure Security Score or the AWS Security dashboard there. But I mean, it looks neat. I just have no personal experience with it. And then our last question here, just to wrap this up, can you speak to the impact of white box versus gray box versus black box when cloud pen testing? And that's a great question. I think, so first of all, if we go straight to the black box approach and say we know nothing about our environment, there can be a very limited attack surface depending on what you're looking at. So AWS, for instance, by nature, buttoned up a little bit more. Azure, and so yeah, a black box against AWS is basically, I would say, like an external pen test or like a black box application assessment. It would have to focus more on the application side though, versus the cloud environment for AWS. Without any knowledge. And with Microsoft, there's a little bit more you can do for enumeration, and you can find a little bit more about the environments, but you're still limited to that external barrier, right? You have to find some creds or otherwise get in past that. There's not much that's sitting out there other than whatever services you have published, which again, often would be web applications of some sort. So that going back there, I would say that a cloud pen test without giving any access is basically just an external pen test, really, or an application assessment. Without that extra without being able to look deeper into there, you just are not going to. I don't know that you could rightly call it a cloud pen test, because yeah, you're not looking at any of the things specific to the cloud that are there. You might look at storage accounts, for instance, S3 buckets, stuff like that. But besides that, yeah, there's really not much there. Moving into the gray box, that's kind of where we go with our assumed access initially, is that we look for a standard user account, and that's what I would kind of equate to a gray box. You have a little bit more depth looking into the environment. And then the white box approach, I would say, is when we use the security auditor or reader accounts to really look holistically at your entire environment and see from a bird's eye view down what you're doing there. So I guess those are kind of the three stages, and we do touch on all of them to some extent, at least with Azure. Like I said, AWS slightly less. We will do external unauthenticated black box testing per se, but it'll be against, making sure that storage is properly configured and looking at any network services, but it wouldn't be a bona fide application deep dive. So I hope that answers your question there. Just that our assumed access model aims to take over kind of that gray box / white box model where you have full visibility. And that just allows us to identify additional attack vectors. We're always happy to, put limits on that. If you want to strictly do assumed access and no bird's eye view, we're happy to do that too, just to give you a realistic view of what's out there. But yeah, if at all possible, it's always nice to be able to just kind of give it a glance over and make sure that you're securing everything else as well. So hopefully that answered your questions. Does anybody else have anything else before we wrap up here? And I just want to really quick mention here, we're going to run back here. I want to tell you guys about a webinar that's coming up in a few weeks. It is right here. So this is going to be adding value to a traditional pen test with Phil Rowland, Alex Hammerstone, and Shane Hartman. I think it's going to be a great webinar and might give you some great ideas for improving your normal internal, external pen tests. So yeah, hit us up there. And thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thank you guys so much. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate everyone joining us today. And we definitely look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Everyone take care. Have a great afternoon.